She was just a maid. Nobody. Invisible. The kind of woman a room full of powerful people looked straight through without blinking. But when a manicured hand flew through the air aimed at an old woman's face, it was her. Grace Moretti, curvy, tired, wearing a uniform that cost less than the flowers on the table, who stepped in front of it. And the man watching from across the ballroom felt something crack open inside his chest that had been sealed shut for 11 years. He was Lorenzo Cavallero, the most feared name in all of southern Italy. And his world would never be the same again. Welcome, besties. You are so watching one of the most intense, dangerous, breathtaking love stories on this channel right now. Before we dive in, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, smash that subscribe button so you never miss a story, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I want to hear from all of you. Now, let's go. Grace Moretti had been invisible for most of her 27 years, and she had made peace with that. She wasn't born into the kind of family that got noticed. Her mother had cleaned hotel rooms for 30 years with hands so cracked and dry they looked like old maps. Her father had left before Grace was old enough to know his face from a photograph. She had grown up learning that people like her existed to serve, to work, to disappear quietly into the background of richer people's lives, and to be grateful for the opportunity. Which was exactly how she had ended up in the Villa Cavallero on a warm Friday evening in late October, wearing a black uniform 2 sizes too big, carrying a silver tray of champagne glasses through the most extravagant private gathering she had ever seen in her life. The villa sat on the hills above Naples like it owned the sky. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, flowers flown in from 3 different countries. The guest list read like a who's who of Italy's most powerful families, old money and new power, politicians and businessmen, women draped in diamonds, men whose handshakes moved economies. The Cavallero family was celebrating the 72nd birthday of Donna Elia Cavallero, matriarch of the most powerful crime dynasty in the South. Grace didn't know any of that when she took the job. She had simply needed the money. She moved through the crowd the way she'd been trained, eyes down, pace steady, never making contact, never lingering. The tray was heavy and her feet already ached, but she kept her expression smooth and her movements quiet. Invisible. Just the way they liked it. She noticed the old woman immediately. Donna Elia sat at the center of the main salon on a high-backed chair that may as well have been a throne. She was small and silver-haired, with the kind of face that had once been extraordinarily beautiful and had aged into something even more powerful, dignified, sharp-eyed, deeply knowing. She wore dark green silk and a single strand of pearls, and she watched everything in the room with the calm attention of a woman who had seen every kind of human behavior and was no longer surprised by any of it. Grace caught herself staring and looked away quickly. She moved to the far corner of the room to refresh her tray, and that was when she heard it. A voice, sharp and cold as a winter blade, cutting through the low hum of conversation. "You had no business speaking to him." "None. Do you understand me?" Grace turned slightly. A woman had appeared beside Donna Elia's chair, young, exquisitely dressed, with a particular kind of beauty that came paired with the absolute conviction that the world owed her everything. She was leaning down toward the old woman, her voice low but vicious, the words coming fast and quiet enough that the nearby guests couldn't quite make them out. But Grace could. "You are an embarrassment," the woman hissed. "You always have been. Sitting here tonight as if any of this is still yours. His empire belongs to the future now, old woman. Not to you." Donna Elia said nothing. Her chin lifted slightly. Her expression didn't change. But Grace saw it, the smallest tremor in the old woman's hands resting in her lap. A fragile flicker behind those sharp eyes. The kind of flicker that happened when someone was trying very hard not to let a wound show. Grace's tray was still in her hands. Her feet still ached. The champagne glasses still needed to be circulated. None of this was her business. She was invisible. That was the arrangement. Then the woman's hand moved. It happened quickly. A sharp, contemptuous swing aimed directly at Donna Elia's face. The kind of slap that wasn't about pain. It was about humiliation. About making sure an old woman understood exactly what she was worth. Grace moved faster.
She didn't think.
Her body simply stepped, placing herself between the swinging hand and Donna Alaya's face. The slap connected with Grace's cheek instead, snapping her head sideways, sending 2 champagne glasses sliding from her tray and shattering across the marble floor. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot. Everything stopped. Grace stood there with her hand pressed to her stinging cheek, the broken glass catching the chandelier light at her feet, and 50 of Italy's most powerful people staring at her in perfect, breathless silence. She had no idea that the man standing at the far end of the room, who had just turned at the sound of breaking glass, was Lorenzo Cavallero. She had no idea that he had watched every second of it. She had no idea what she had just walked into. Lorenzo didn't move. He stood completely still with a crystal glass in his hand and his jaw so tight it could have been carved from the same marble as the floors. He was 34 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that people described in various ways depending on how afraid of him they were. Black, some said. Like coal. Like a tunnel with no end. His face was the kind of handsome that came with danger attached, hard lines and a mouth that rarely smiled and, when it did, made even careful people uncertain whether they should feel relieved or more afraid. He had been running the Cavallero Empire since he was 23. 11 years of building, expanding, protecting, and when necessary, destroying. He was not a man who felt things suddenly, but something moved in him in that moment. Something old and buried, and entirely unscheduled. A tremor, deep and quiet, like a fault line shifting beneath stone. He watched the maid lower her hand from her cheek. He watched her look at the broken glass with the expression of someone doing rapid, private calculations about consequences. He watched her look at his mother, whose eyes, he noticed from across the room, had gone very bright and very still, and he watched the maid ask, quietly, if she was all right. His mother nodded, and something in her nod was different from her usual composure. Something softer, grateful. Lorenzo set his glass down on the nearest surface. His head of security, Marco, appeared at his shoulder within seconds. Shall I remove her?
No.
Lorenzo's voice was quiet. Who is the other one? Marco followed his gaze to the woman who had thrown the slap. Valentina Greco, daughter of a business associate.
A guest.
Someone who had apparently decided that the birthday celebration of the most powerful woman in the room was the right occasion for a power play. Escort Signorina Greco out, Lorenzo said. Quietly. Then tell her father, I want a word with him at his earliest inconvenience. Marco moved. Lorenzo's eyes went back to the maid, who had already crouched down and was carefully picking up the broken glass from the floor with bare hands, her dark hair falling forward over her face, her movements composed and methodical, as if she had not just stepped in front of a slap intended for the matriarch of the most dangerous family in southern Italy. He had never seen anyone do anything like that in his life. And he found, standing there in the middle of his mother's birthday celebration surrounded by people who existed in a state of careful calculation of what everything cost and what everything gained, that he could not quite look away. Later that night, the party was winding down and most of the guests had moved to the terrace or the upper salons. The main room was quieter now, the cleaning staff beginning the careful work of restoring order. Grace was on her knees beside the fireplace, collecting a scatter of flower petals and small napkins that had drifted across the floor when she heard footsteps stop behind her. She turned and stood. He was closer than she expected. Close enough that she had to look up, and she was not a short woman.
Dark eyes.
A jaw like architecture. The kind of stillness that wasn't peace, it was control. Every inch of him radiating the specific energy of someone who is always the most dangerous thing in any room. You're hurt, he said. His voice was lower than she'd imagined. A careful voice. Measured, like a man who had long ago learned that words were a kind of weapon and treated them accordingly. Grace lifted her hand to her cheek briefly. It's nothing. It isn't nothing. He said it without raising his voice, but with the absolute finality of a man who did not argue with facts. I'm fine, sir. I apologize for the broken glassware. The cost will be deducted from Stop. Just the one word. Flat and quiet.
She stopped.
He looked at her for a moment with that stillness that felt like being examined rather than seen. You shielded my mother. Grace blinked. His mother. The old woman in the green silk. She glanced around the room as if checking she had understood correctly, then looked back at him. She was about to be hurt, Grace said simply. So were you. Yes. She met his eyes and didn't quite manage to hold them. But she's older. Something crossed his face. So brief and so internal she would not have been able to name it even if she'd been watching for it. It was gone before it fully arrived. What's your name? Grace. Grace Moretti. Where are you from? Grace Moretti? Secondigliano. She said it the way people from poorer neighborhoods said the names of poorer neighborhoods around wealthy people, braced, slightly defensive, waiting for the register on his face to shift. It didn't shift. His expression didn't change at all. Go to the kitchen, he said. Have someone look at your face. I told you it's fine. That wasn't a suggestion. He walked away before she could respond. She stood there watching his back, straight as a wall, completely unhurried, and felt the oddest thing. Not fear, exactly. Something adjacent to it but with different edges. Something she had no clean word for. She went to the kitchen. There was ice wrapped in a cloth waiting for her when she arrived. One of the older kitchen staff pressed it into her hand with a look that was carefully neutral and said, "The signore asked us to see to you." Grace pressed the ice to her cheek and said nothing. She didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, she returned to the staffing agency expecting to be told that her services at the Villa Cavallero were no longer required. Broken glassware. A scene. An incident involving a guest and the matriarch. These were not the ingredients of a successful placement. Instead, the woman at the agency, a small, perpetually startled woman named Carla, who had been placing domestic staff for 20 years, slid a piece of paper across the desk with the expression of someone who had been given instructions she did not fully understand but intended to follow precisely. You've been requested, Carla said. Grace looked at the paper. It was an offer of full-time employment. Housekeeper at Villa Cavallero. The salary figure made her read the line twice, then a third time. She looked up at Carla. There's a mistake. There isn't. Carla folded her hands. The request came directly from the household manager this morning. Lorenzo Cavallero wants you on staff. Grace sat with that for a moment. The dark eyes. The quiet voice. The way he'd said it wasn't a suggestion. She knew she should be careful. Every rational thought in her head said careful. She knew who the Cavalleros were in the way everyone in Naples knew, not from headlines or confessions but from the particular quality of silence that gathered whenever the name came up in certain conversations. She took the job anyway. She wasn't entirely sure why. The salary, she told herself. The stability. The fact that her current living situation, a two-room apartment with a radiator that worked intermittently and a landlord who had started leaving notes under her door, was not a long-term plan. Those were all real reasons. She didn't examine the other reason too closely. The Villa Cavallero was different in the daytime. Quieter and more human somehow. The grandeur less theatrical, without the crowd of guests to perform for. The household ran on a precise schedule maintained by Signora Ferretti, the head housekeeper, who was 63 years old, had been with the family for 40 years, and had the air of someone who had seen everything and been shaken by almost none of it. She showed Grace the house with efficient thoroughness. The family quarters were the west wing, off limits unless specifically summoned. The main salon, dining rooms, and library were cleaned in the mornings before the family was active. The kitchen staff handled the ground floor. Grace would primarily manage the upper corridors, guest rooms, and Donna Elia's personal suite. The signora is particular, Ferretti said, meaning Donna Elia. But fair. She will not speak down to you. She appreciates careful work and quiet company. A pause. She asked for you specifically. Grace looked up from the notebook, where she'd been recording the schedule. She did. Ferretti regarded her with an expression that was both assessing and, very faintly, approving. She said you had good instincts. Grace wasn't sure what to do with that. She wrote it down in the notebook alongside the cleaning schedule as if it were the same kind of information. The first week passed in careful routine. She learned the house. She learned the rhythms. She learned that Donna Elia liked her morning tea at 7, not a minute earlier or later, with a single almond biscuit and the day's newspaper folded to the cultural pages. She learned that the old woman read obsessively, kept a small garden on her private terrace that she tended herself with great seriousness, and spoke to Grace with a directness that felt, after years of being treated as furniture, almost startling. What she did not see, what she had no way of knowing, was that Lorenzo Cavallero knew exactly where she was in his house at all times. Not through surveillance, though the villa had plenty of that. Through the kind of attention that a man doesn't announce. A careful, private awareness. The way he adjusted his route through certain corridors in the morning. The way he listened, without appearing to listen, when Moretti gave her daily household report and Grace's name came up. He told himself it was gratitude. She had protected his mother. He had a debt. It was a clean, manageable explanation. He held on to it. A few days later, Grace was in the library returning a stack of books Donna Elia had finished when she heard voices in the corridor, low, tense, in the particular register of a conversation not meant to be overhead. She wasn't trying to listen. She was simply there, behind the tall bookcase, arms full of volumes, when the door opened. She cannot stay in this house. A man's voice. Cold, precise, familiar in the way voices of authority become familiar. It's a complication. She's a housekeeper, Cesare. Lorenzo's voice. Quieter. More controlled. She witnessed the incident with Valentina Greco. Valentina's father is making noise. He's saying the girl was provoked, that your staff acted inappropriately. My staff. Something shifted in Lorenzo's tone. Grace could hear it even behind the bookcase. A kind of tightening. My staff stepped in front of a blow aimed at my mother. That is not a complication. That is something else entirely. A silence. She's nobody, Cesare said. From Secondigliano. We know nothing about her. Then find out. Very calm. Very final. And Cesare. The next time someone from this family raises a hand near my mother, I want to know about it before I find out by watching a cleaning girl take the hit. A pause. That particular failure of information is a more pressing concern. The voices moved away down the corridor. Grace stood behind the bookcase, with a copy of Leopardi's Canti pressed against her chest, and her heart hitting her ribs at a pace that had nothing to do with the exertion of carrying books. She put the volumes away in careful order. She left the library. She went back to her work. She told herself the conversation meant nothing. She was not entirely convincing. That evening, Donna Elia called her to the private terrace. The old woman was at her garden. Small clay pots arranged along the railing, herbs and flowers, the kind of garden that was less about beauty than about continuity, about having something living to tend. Sit, Donna Elia said, without looking up from the rosemary she was pruning. Grace sat. For a few minutes there was only the sound of scissors and the distant noise of the city below the hills. You're afraid, Donna Elia said. Grace opened her mouth. Don't deny it. I recognize it. Most people who come into this family's orbit are afraid. It is an appropriate response. The old woman set down her scissors and looked at Grace with those sharp, still eyes. But you weren't afraid the other night. When that hand came at me, you didn't calculate. You just moved. No, Grace said. I didn't think. Exactly. Something in Donna Elia's expression softened slightly. Not sentimentally, it wasn't that kind of softening. It was the softening of recognition. Of someone seeing something they value in an unexpected place. My son has been surrounded by people who calculate everything his entire adult life. Every gesture, every word, every kindness, all of it calculated. All of it purchased. She picked up her scissors again. He has forgotten what it looks like when someone simply acts because something is right. Grace was quiet. I am telling you this, the old woman said, because you deserve to know why he's watching you. Grace's hands stilled in her lap. Donna Elia smiled, the small, knowing smile of a woman who has watched a great many people try to hide a great many things. He thinks I don't notice. He has always underestimated my noticing. She turned back to her Rosemary. Just be careful, Grace. This family carries a great deal of history. Not all of it is safe. I know, Grace said quietly. No, the old woman replied. Not yet. But you will. The following week brought a change in the air of the villa that Grace felt before she understood it. More cars. More meetings behind closed doors. More men arriving in the early evening and leaving long after she should have been asleep. She kept her head down and her pace steady. Invisible, the way she'd always known how to be, except that it was becoming harder. He didn't speak to her often. A word in a corridor. A glance across a room. Once in the garden, when she had dropped a bucket and knelt to collect what had spilled, she had looked up to find him standing on the path 3 feet away, watching her with that particular quality of attention that she was learning to recognize. Not assessing, not predatory.
Something more internal than that.
Like a man watching something he is trying to understand. I can carry that, he said. I have it, she said. Grace. Her name, just that. The way he said it was different from how anyone else said it. Quieter. Like it meant something more than just her name. She straightened with the bucket. Thank you. I have it. He stepped back. Let her pass. She could feel his eyes following her all the way to the kitchen door. That night she lay in her small staff room and listened to the sounds of the villa settling around her and told herself, with great firmness, all of the reasons that what she was feeling was an entirely predictable and entirely manageable response to an attractive, powerful man paying attention to her, and that she was not going to do anything stupid about it. She was a maid. He ran an empire. These were facts. She repeated them until she fell asleep. 3 weeks into her employment, a man named Fabio arrived. He was the youngest son of a business associate from Rome, visiting for a week while some matter between the families was concluded. He was 29, handsome in a loose, easy way, the kind of handsome that came without menace attached, and he apparently found Grace enormously interesting. He found reasons to be in whatever room she was working in. He brought his coffee to the kitchen when she was there instead of having it brought to him. He learned her name on the first day and used it every time he saw her, which was frequently because he was apparently developing a remarkable number of small logistical needs that only the housekeeper could address. You know, he said one morning, leaning against the kitchen doorframe while Grace organized the linens, there's a restaurant in the Quartiere Spagnoli. The best pasta e fagioli in the city. I've been trying to think of someone worth taking. Grace looked at him over the stack of folded tablecloths. That's a lovely thought. I'm asking you. He smiled. Easy, uncomplicated. No calculation behind it, which was, she thought, genuinely refreshing. I work here, she said. On Sundays you don't. She was about to answer. She genuinely wasn't sure what she was going to say, when she became aware, with the particular sensitivity she had developed over the past weeks, that someone was in the corridor just outside the kitchen door. She looked up. Lorenzo was standing in the doorway. He had a folder in his hand and the expression of a man who had paused on his way to somewhere else and found himself in a place he had not planned to be. He looked at Fabio. He looked at Grace. He looked at Fabio again. Something moved across his face. Very briefly. Then the control reasserted itself and his expression returned to its default. Composed, unreadable, slightly formidable.
Fabio, he said.
My father wanted a word. Fabio straightened. Right now. It seemed to be his preference. Fabio gave Grace an apologetic smile, promised to finish the conversation later, and followed Lorenzo out of the kitchen. Grace stared at the tablecloths for a moment. She went back to folding. She wasn't sure why she was smiling. That evening she was in the upper corridor when she heard, from behind the study door, a voice she recognized as Marco's, the head of security. Fabio Rossetti needs to be managed. He's spending a lot of time in the domestic areas. I noticed. Lorenzo's voice. Flat. Should I move him to the East Guest House? More distance from the main house.
No.
Find him something to occupy his time. Something thorough. Keep him in meetings. A pause. Then Marco said carefully, something specific is driving this concern? A longer pause. No. Lorenzo said. General hospitality. Grace moved away from the door. She went down the stairs and through the kitchen and out into the small courtyard where the staff sometimes took their breaks, and she sat on the stone bench and looked at the night sky and breathed very carefully for several minutes. She was not going to think about this. She was going to think about her salary, her apartment, her radiator, all the practical things she was here for. She was going to be sensible. She lasted approximately 3 more days. It was the 1st of November, and it was raining hard enough that the whole city smelled like wet stone and old history when everything changed. Grace was alone in Donna Elias' suite, replacing the flowers, when she heard shouting from the floor below. Not the contained tension she had grown accustomed to, actual shouting. Then glass breaking. Then silence, which was somehow worse. She was still standing there holding a vase when Moretti appeared in the doorway, her face carefully composed in the way it was always carefully composed, but with something underneath that was different.
Tighter.
Go to the east wing, Moretti said. Stay there. What happened? Go to the east wing, Grace. She went. But she was at the top of the east staircase when she heard it, Lorenzo's voice from the courtyard below, tight with something she had never heard in it before. Not anger exactly. Something darker than anger. More urgent. She looked out the window. There were men in the courtyard. 3 she didn't recognize and 2 of Lorenzo's guards. There was a conversation happening at a volume and temperature that suggested it was not a conversation. One of the unfamiliar men had his hand on something inside his jacket. Lorenzo was standing in the middle of it with his arms at his sides and his face perfectly still, and she understood, seeing him like that, completely calm and completely terrifying in his calm, that this was what he was. Not just a powerful man. Something more fundamental than that. Someone who had learned in the bone-deep way that only came from surviving things, exactly how far to push and exactly how still to be. The confrontation ended. The strangers left. One of the guards had a cut above his eye. Lorenzo stood in the rain for a moment after they were gone, alone in the courtyard, not moving. Then he looked up. Grace stepped back from the window. She didn't know if he'd seen her. She told herself it didn't matter.
She knew it did.
The next morning he was in the kitchen when she came down for the early preparations. He was sitting at the table with a coffee and the newspaper and a cut on the back of his left hand that someone had bandaged in the night. He looked like a man who had slept, but not well. He looked up when she came in. I should have told you, he said, without preamble, that this house is not always a safe place to be. Grace set her cleaning supplies down. I know what family I'm working for. Knowing and understanding are different things. I'm from Secondigliano, she said. I've known what danger looks like since I was 8 years old. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the measuring look.
Something more open than that.
Something she wasn't prepared for. Are you all right? She asked. She hadn't planned to. The question simply came out. He seemed, briefly, almost startled. As if the question itself were an unusual thing. As if no one in his daily life had asked it with the straightforward, uncomplicated sincerity she'd applied to it. I'm fine, he said. Your hand disagrees. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. The idea of a smile, maybe. The possibility of one. It's nothing. She raised an eyebrow. That's what I said about my cheek. And he did smile then. Small, brief, real in a way that rearranged something in the architecture of his face, made him look younger and less fortified. It appeared and disappeared so quickly, she almost doubted it. Touché, Grace Moretti, he said. She made his coffee, brought it to him without being asked, the way she'd learned he took it, and went about her morning. But she was aware, in a way that had moved past simple awareness into something else entirely, that his eyes followed her for most of it. A few days later, something arrived for her. It was left on the small table outside her room. A package, neatly wrapped, no note. Inside was a pair of soft leather gloves, the kind for careful work, quality she had never been able to afford, with a small card that read only, for the broken glass. She held them for a long time. She didn't ask who had sent them. She knew. November moved forward, and the tension in the house didn't ease. She learned, through the particular osmosis of domestic life. The things overheard, the conversations people had near household staff assuming they weren't paying attention, that the incident in the courtyard had been a warning from a rival family. The Ferrara clan, based in Palermo, had been pressing into Cavallero territory for months. The birthday gathering had been a show of strength, and Valentina Greco's behavior, and her father's subsequent noise about it, was connected to a negotiation that had gone sour. Grace kept her head down and her pace steady. She also kept her eyes open. She noticed things. Moretti noticed that she noticed things, and occasionally, with the peculiar discretion of a woman who had kept a Mafia household for 40 years, told her slightly more than she needed to know. Not secrets. Just context. Just enough to understand why certain rooms were off limits on certain days, why the kitchen staff should have extra provisions on hand for this week, why she should not use the north gate after dark. Small things. The kind of knowledge that kept you safe. A week before Christmas, Fabio returned for a second visit. He found her in the library and sat down across from her reading table without invitation and said, "You never gave me an answer about the pasta e fagioli." "I've been busy," Grace said, without looking up from the catalog she was updating. "It's Sunday." She looked up. He had a nice face. Open and unguarded in a way she had come to associate with people who had never needed to build walls because nothing dangerous had ever come over them. It was a kind of innocence she might have found entirely charming under different circumstances. Under different circumstances, she would not have found herself, 8 weeks into a job in the home of the most powerful man in southern Italy, feeling a particular quality of awareness every time she heard a door open or footsteps in a corridor. "I can't," she said. "Why not?" She opened her mouth to find something practical to say. "Because she's on duty." Both of them looked up. Lorenzo was in the doorway. He had the particular quality of stillness he always carried, but there was something underneath it today that was different. A tension around the jaw. A brightness in the dark eyes that she had learned to read the way Moretti had learned to read the weather, not for prediction exactly, just for awareness. "I'm in the library," Grace said. "Which is part of the house. Which is where you work." He looked at Fabio. "I believe my mother is asking for someone to accompany her on her afternoon walk. She mentioned your name specifically." Fabio looked between them. He was not, Grace suspected, unintelligent. He stood up. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "Another time, Grace." He left. Lorenzo remained in the doorway. "I can manage my own schedule," Grace said, the moment they were alone. "I know." "Then why?" "Because," he said, and then stopped. The silence between them was different now, charged in a way it hadn't been before. She was aware of the space between them, the 12 feet of library floor, as if it were a physical thing with weight and texture. "He's not right for you," Lorenzo said. Very quiet. Grace put her pen down. "With respect, signore, that is none of your—" "Lorenzo." The correction, the same one he'd given her in the first week. Then, steadier, "I know it isn't my business." "Then why are you standing in my doorway telling me who is and isn't right for me?" He looked at her. Really looked, with none of his usual control in the way, and she felt it like something physical, the full, unguarded weight of his attention with nothing filtering it. "I don't know," he said. And it was clear, in the way he said it, that this admission was costing him something. That he was a man who was not accustomed to not knowing, who had built his entire life and empire on the principle of knowing, and this particular not knowing was something new and therefore alarming. Grace held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. "I have work to finish," she said. He left, and she stared at the catalog for a full 5 minutes before she was able to read a single word. Christmas came and went, and the New Year arrived, and the Ferrara situation did not resolve, it worsened. She heard it from Moretti one morning in January. There had been an incident in the city. One of Lorenzo's men, a young lieutenant he had known for years, had been attacked. He survived, barely. The message was clear. The house locked down, more guards, restricted movement. Grace's range of the villa was limited to specific areas. She understood.
She didn't complain.
What she didn't expect was the evening 4 days later when she came to bring Donna Elia's nighttime tea and found Lorenzo already there, sitting across from his mother in the low lamplight, talking in a way that was different from every other time she had seen him. Quieter, more unguarded, the armor partially set aside.
He stopped when she came in.
She set the tray down and began to retreat. "Stay," Donna Elia said. She looked at the old woman, then at Lorenzo. "Please," he said. "Just the word. No authority behind it. Just the word." She sat. They talked, the three of them, for an hour. Not about danger or empires or the particular mathematics of power. About Naples. About the history of the city below the hills. About Donna Elia's childhood in a small village in Calabria. About the grandmother Grace had barely known. About food and seasons and the particular smell of rain on old stone. Ordinary things. Human things. At some point the tea was finished and the fire burned lower, and Grace realized that she had somehow ended up in the chair closest to Lorenzo, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm, and that at some point in the last hour he had turned toward her in his chair, angled like a plant toward light, and that neither of them had mentioned it. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and understood, with a clarity that was not comfortable, that she was in serious trouble. The danger came in February, on a cold Tuesday evening, without warning. She had gone to the market, approved, routine, one of her standard weekly errands, with a car and a driver provided by the household. The driver was Marco's nephew, young, reliable. Nothing remarkable about the journey until the car pulled to a stop 2 blocks from the market and Marco's nephew got out to check the tire and didn't come back. 3 minutes.
4.
Then the door opened, and it was not him. Grace learned several things very quickly in the next few hours. She learned that the Ferrara clan had decided that the best way to communicate their seriousness to Lorenzo Cavallero was not through his men, but through something he had not expected to care about. She learned that 3 men who smelled like cold air and old grudges and held their patience like professionals had been watching the villa's household routines for weeks. She learned that being invisible was sometimes a kind of exposure. They were not violent with her. That was its own kind of message, the threatening precision of people who wanted to be understood rather than just feared. She was held in a warehouse on the edge of the city, in a room with a chair and a small window and the muffled sounds of the port, and she sat in that chair and breathed very deliberately and told herself she had survived worse, and ignored the part of her mind that was not entirely sure that was true. She also told herself, with great discipline, not to think about Lorenzo. She thought about Lorenzo. At the villa, the next 6 hours were the kind of thing that Marco would later describe, in the careful language of someone who had seen Lorenzo Cavallero angry before and understood the difference, as a new category of behavior. He didn't rage. He didn't shout. He went very, very still, in the way he always went still, except that the quality of the stillness was different, compressed, focused, generating its own heat the way a lens focused light into fire. "Everything," he said to Marco. "Every resource. Every contact. Every favor I owed from Palermo to Rome. Tonight. Lorenzo." "She went to the market," he said. "She went to the market, and my house failed to protect her." He looked at Marco. "I need her back, Marco. By morning." Marco went. Donna Elia found her son in the courtyard at midnight, standing in the cold in shirt sleeves, looking at the city lights below the hill. She stood beside him, without speaking for a moment. "You're afraid," she said. "I'm handling it, Lorenzo." Her voice, when she chose to use it as a correction, was the same voice it had always been. Not loud, but absolute. "I didn't ask if you were handling it. I said you're afraid." A long silence. "She stepped in front of a blow meant for you," he said. "She didn't calculate. She didn't think. She just—" "I know." His mother took his arm. "I know what she is. She's not safe here. I thought keeping her close would protect her." "Yes." Donna Elia was quiet for a moment. "Lorenzo, you have been running this family since you were 23 years old. In all that time, I have watched you build walls tall enough to keep out armies. And I have watched this girl walk through every single one of them without even trying." She patted his arm. "Stop standing here. Go get her.
He went.
The warehouse was on the eastern edge of the Port District, in a neighborhood that was entirely accustomed to keeping its lights off and its questions unasked. Lorenzo arrived at 3 in the morning with Marco and 4 others, none of whom made unnecessary noise. What happened inside the warehouse in the next 20 minutes was not something that ended up in any official record. But when it was over, Lorenzo walked down a corridor to the room with the chair and the small window. Grace was standing when he opened the door. Not because she'd been told to stand. Because she had been sitting in that chair for 9 hours and had decided, at some point in the last 30 minutes, that she would be on her feet when whoever came through that door came through it. She looked at him. He looked at her. She had, he noticed, been crying. The evidence was in the redness around her eyes rather than any current tears. She was not crying now. She was standing with her shoulders back and her jaw set, meeting his eyes with the particular composure of a woman who had cried the scared part out and was now on the other side of it. He crossed the room in 5 steps. He put his hands on either side of her face very carefully, the way someone handled something that had almost been lost, and he said her name, just that, and then he pulled her in and held her. And she pressed her face against his chest and felt the tension she had been holding for 9 hours leave her body in one enormous exhale, and neither of them said anything for a long time. He kept his arms around her the whole way back to the car. The villa, when they returned, was quiet. The staff had been told to wait until morning. Donna Elia had apparently gone to bed, or more precisely had gone to her room, which was not quite the same thing. Lorenzo brought Grace to the main salon. He built the fire himself. He made her sit close to it and brought a blanket from somewhere and stood in front of her with the look of a man running checks on something that had been damaged and was calculating the extent. "I'm fine," she said. "Stop saying that. It's still true." "Grace." He sat across from her. The firelight made everything look like an older century, softer and more honest. "I should have." "Don't," she said. "Please. I don't want to hear about security failures and protocol adjustments tonight." He looked at her. "What do you want to hear?" She met his eyes across the fire. "You." A pause. Something shifted in him. That slow fault line shift she had come to recognize. "Me. Just you. Not the signore. Not the family. Not the empire. Just you." He looked at the fire for a moment. And then he began to talk. He told her about his father, who had been, by most accounts, a hard man but a man who had loved his family with a particular ferocity, and who had died when Lorenzo was 23 in a way that left no room for a proper goodbye, and a great deal of room for a 23-year-old to have to build himself into something sufficient in a very short time. He told her about the loneliness of the position, which was not something he had ever said out loud to anyone. He told her that his house had been very quiet before she came, and that the quality of the quiet had been different from what it was now. Emptier. He told her about the evening in the library, how he had stood in that doorway and realized he was angry at a perfectly decent man for no defensible reason, and how disturbing that had been, and how much more disturbing it had become when he sat with it long enough to understand what it meant. Grace listened. She did not interrupt. She sat with her hands in her lap and the blanket around her shoulders and let him give her this private, unguarded inventory of himself, and felt the weight of what it meant that he was giving it to her. When he finished, the fire had burned lower and the room was close and warm and the distance between them had changed while they weren't looking at it. "Lorenzo," she said. He looked at her. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the sofa, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she took his bandaged hand, the cut from November that had healed but left the faintest trace, in both of hers and held it. "I was scared tonight," she said. "Not for myself." She looked at her hands around his. "I was scared that I wouldn't see you again." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then his hand turned over and held hers instead. "Grace," he said, and his voice was different now, no control in it at all, raw and certain and quiet. "I went into that warehouse tonight, and every second I was not in that room with you was—" He stopped. Steadied. "I do not have good words for certain things." "You don't need words," she said. He looked at her for a moment with everything unguarded. All of it, the walls and the armor and the 11 years of composure set completely aside. And then he leaned forward and his forehead touched hers and they stayed like that, just breathing, just close, and the fire crackled, and the old house settled around them, and the world outside was exactly as dangerous as it had always been. It would always be as dangerous as it had always been. But right now there was just this. The moment that followed was not something Grace could have described afterward in precise terms. It was close and quiet, and entirely theirs. The kind of moment that closed itself around you like a room with no windows, where only the two of you existed and the rest of the world contracted to a respectful distance and waited. The morning came gentle and gray, and Grace was aware of it arriving with a particular quality of dread. The morning was when things became real. When the firelight was gone, and the distances reasserted themselves, and she was still, inescapably, the maid. And he was still, inescapably, Lorenzo Cavallero. She left the salon before dawn. She went to her room. She sat on her bed. She thought, with excruciating clarity, about all of the ways last night had been an anomaly. A crisis. The particular intimacy of fear and relief. He would be himself again this morning, composed, certain, inhabiting his world without question, and she would be herself, and the distance between those two selves was still exactly as wide as it had ever been. She began to pack. Not everything. She told herself it was not everything, just some things, just in case, just to have options. But the bag on the bed was growing, and she knew that was not honest. She was almost finished when Donna Elia appeared in the doorway. The old woman looked at the bag. She looked at Grace. She did not change her expression. "He's looking for you," she said. "I need to. He's been looking for you for 40 minutes. Grace folded a shirt and placed it in the bag. "It's better this way." "For whom?" "For everyone." She pressed her lips together. "I'm not," she stopped. "You're not what?" Donna Elia came into the room without being invited, sat in the chair by the window, and waited. "I'm not the right person for this." Grace gestured around her. The small room, the uniform hanging on the hook, the entire architecture of her life here. "I don't fit. And eventually he'll understand that too, and I'd rather be gone before he has the chance to tell you." Donna Elia's voice was not unkind. It was clear. Grace didn't answer. "I have watched my son for 34 years, the old woman said. "I have watched him become something I prayed he wouldn't have to become. I have watched him close. I have watched him maintain. I have watched him move through rooms full of people and be completely alone." A pause. "I have never watched him take off his armor for anyone. Not once. Not even for me. Not since he was very young." She looked at Grace steadily. "Until you." The bag sat open on the bed. Grace's hands were still. "You're afraid he'll choose the Empire," Donna Elia said. "Shouldn't I be?" "Yes." In honesty, yes. The old woman did not soften it. "That fear is not irrational. This life has costs." She was quiet for a moment. "But I will tell you what I know about my son. When he chooses something, truly chooses it, he does not waver. Not ever. In 34 years, I have never seen him waver on a true choice." Footsteps in the corridor. The door was open and he was there. He looked at the bag. He looked at Grace. He looked at the bag again, and something passed through his face that she had not seen before. Not control, not armor, something younger and more exposed than anything she had seen from him. A fear, actually. Real and visible and entirely human. Donna Elia rose from the chair, gave her son a brief, pointed look, and left the room with the particular discretion of a woman who had engineered outcomes before and recognized a successfully engineered exit. Lorenzo stepped into the room. "You're leaving," he said. "I was thinking." "Grace." He crossed to her in 4 steps, and she didn't move, and he stopped close enough that she had to look up at him. "Tell me why." "Because I don't belong here." "That's not a reason." "Because I'm a housekeeper and she gestured. "This." "That's not a reason either." "Lorenzo, tell me the real reason." "Not demanding." Something much more difficult than demanding, asking. Genuinely asking. Vulnerable and still, with all of his considerable mass and power poised in a kind of supplication. She looked at him. "Because I am terrified," she said. Of wanting something I'm going to lose. He reached out and took her hand.
Slowly.
The way someone picks up something they've almost broken before and have learned to be careful with. I am also terrified, he said. I have been terrified since October, when you stepped in front of a slap meant for my mother and looked at me afterward like you had no idea who I was. I didn't. I know. Something in his voice. Grace. I have never in my life wanted to be known before. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She understood. She looked at her bag on the bed for a long moment. Then she began, one by one, to take the things out and put them back. His exhale was quiet and entirely real, and he pressed his forehead to hers the same way he had the night before, except this time there was less fear in it and something else. Relief so complete it was almost reverent. I'm going to make this safer, he said. The Ferrara situation will be handled. I will not let. I know. She pressed a hand to his chest. I know you will. You shouldn't have to live this way. I come from Secondigliano, she said again, quietly. This is not the first time I've been afraid. And I will not leave, because someone wants me to be afraid. He held her face in his hands and looked at her with everything still uncovered, still open, and said, Tell me what you need from me. Just this, she said. Just don't disappear. Never, he said. And it sounded like the kind of promise that costs something to make, the kind built not from words but from what the speaker is willing to sacrifice to keep it. March came in cold, and the Ferrara situation, as Lorenzo had promised, was handled. She didn't ask for the details. She understood that there were rooms in his life she was not required to enter. What she did enter was everything else. She had stopped being a housekeeper in any functional sense by the end of February. Moretti had quietly, without comment, absorbed Grace's duties into the household's general management, but she remained in the villa, present and known, a part of the household in a way that had nothing to do with employment. Donna Elia took to inviting her to dinner. Not the formal family dinners, but the quiet ones, the ones that were really just the three of them, and good food, and the particular ease of people who had settled into each other. Lorenzo, for his part, was learning to be seen. It was slow, and not always comfortable for him. He was a man who had spent 11 years ensuring that his interior was opaque, and the habit of opacity didn't break easily. But he worked at it the way he worked at everything, with a deliberate, stubborn consistency that was simply the most admirable thing Grace had ever witnessed in another human being. He left her notes. Small ones, tucked into books she was reading, or left on the kitchen table in the morning. Observations. Lines from things he'd read. Occasionally, a sketch he drew, she had discovered, with the same focused precision he brought to everything, small careful drawings in the margins of documents and notebooks. He showed up when she least expected it and most needed it. When she woke from a nightmare about the warehouse, which happened, sometimes, even months later, he was somehow there, a knock on her door and his voice through the wood, steady and real, asking if she was all right. She started leaving the door unlocked. He sat with her on those nights in the chair by the window while she drank tea, and the dark outside became light. He held her hand, sometimes. He told her things, quiet things, private things, the inventory of himself that he was still slowly offering. She received it. Every piece. She gave pieces back. Her childhood. Her mother's hands. The particular loneliness of growing up in a city that was beautiful and brutal in equal measure, and having no language for either. The dreams she had quietly, carefully kept alive in the back of her mind, a degree she'd started and abandoned for financial reasons, a love of literature she'd never had anyone to share with. He sent someone to the university the following week. She found the enrollment paperwork on her desk. She looked at it for a long time. Then she filled it in. The spring was long and golden and extraordinary in the way that certain periods of life are extraordinary, not because of any single event, but because you have the rare clarity, while you're in them, to know that you are somewhere you will never fully return to. She caught him watching her in the garden one afternoon, really watching, the way she had caught him watching her in those first weeks, except that the quality of the watching was entirely different now. No longer trying to understand. Just present. Just content. She raised an eyebrow. He smiled. Not the small, brief, escaped smile. A full one. The kind that made him look like the 23-year-old he'd had to stop being too quickly.
You're staring, she said.
I'm aware. She went back to her book. She was not, technically, still an employee. She was simply here, in his house, which was also, in some sense, becoming hers, in the slow, incremental way that happens when a place begins to hold the trace of you in it. Your coffee cup in the kitchen cabinet, your books in the library shelves, the particular light that lands in the east sitting room in the afternoon that you have claimed is yours. She heard him cross the garden. Come inside, he said. I'm reading. Grace. His hand at her shoulder, warm and certain. Come inside. She came inside. He led her to the main salon, and she noticed then that things were different. That Donna Elia was there, and Moretti and Marco and several others she had come to know, the household, gathered with the particular arrangement of people who have been asked to be present for something. She looked at Lorenzo. He had something in his hand. He was, she realized with a slowing heartbeat, nervous. Lorenzo Cavallero, who had never in 11 years of running an empire shown fear in a room full of people, was standing in his own salon with his jaw working and his eyes very bright and his hands not entirely still. I am not, he said, a man who does well with uncertainty. She waited. I am also not a man who does well with the prospect of loss. He looked at her. In October, I watched a woman I had never seen before step in front of something meant for my mother. And in November, I learned she was made of steadiness. And in December, of warmth. And in January, of more courage than any person I have known. He paused. In February, I was very afraid. And in March, I learned that being afraid of something is not a reason to stop moving toward it. It's a reason to move more carefully. Donna Elia, from her chair, made a small sound that might have been the beginning of tears. Moretti, beside her, was looking carefully at the ceiling. I don't have clean hands, Lorenzo said. I cannot offer you uncomplicated, but I can offer you loyalty that does not waver, protection that does not fail, a home.
He paused.
Myself, such as I am. He opened his hand. The ring was simple, a single stone, dark and clear, nothing theatrical about it. Grace Moretti, he said. You walked into this house carrying a silver tray and walked straight past 11 years of walls I built to keep people out. I would like you to stay. Permanently. She looked at him. At the ring. At the nervous stillness of him. Waiting. She crossed the space between them, took his face in both her hands the way he had taken hers the night she came home from the warehouse, and she looked at him for a moment with everything open, all the fear and the love and the certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was choosing.
Yes, she said.
The room exhaled. He slid the ring onto her finger and held her hand, and she felt the trembling in him, not weakness, something much more honest than weakness, the particular trembling of someone who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and has finally been given permission to let it rest. Donna Elia was crying. She was not apologizing for it. They married in June, in the garden of the villa, in the morning when the light was best. Nothing extravagant. They had both, in different ways, spent their lives inside the machinery of extravagance, and neither of them wanted it. 30 people. Good food. Donna Elia in the dress she had been planning since February. Moretti holding herself together with the composure of someone who had learned 40 years ago that dignity did not require the absence of feeling. Marco gave a speech that was exactly 11 seconds long and contained one joke that Grace suspected she was not meant to fully understand, and she laughed anyway because she understood enough, and the room laughed with her. Lorenzo danced badly and without apology, which was one of the most wonderful things she had ever seen.
She told him so.
I am a man of many limitations, he said, his arms around her, the garden full of evening light. I am aware. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I find I don't mind. No.
No.
He pressed his mouth to her hair. Nor do I. 8 months later, on a morning in February, the same month that had brought them fear and near loss and also, in its own way, beginnings, Grace came to find him in his study with a single piece of paper in her hand. He looked up from his desk. He read her face before she said a word. He was, after all, a man trained in the particular literacy of people. He stood. She handed him the paper. He read it. He was still for a moment in the way that was no longer the controlled stillness but the other kind, full and interior, and entirely private. "Grace," he said. His voice had the trembling in it again. "I know," she said. He came around the desk and held her, and she let herself be held, and through the study window the light of a February morning fell across the hills above Naples, over the city below, and the house on the hill, and the garden where they had married, and the old woman on her terrace tending her herbs, and everything was exactly as complex and dangerous and alive as it had ever been. And they were exactly where they were supposed to be. This story reminds us that courage doesn't always look like standing on a battlefield. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a maid's uniform stepping between a raised hand and an old woman's face without thinking twice. Sometimes the truest bravery is the quiet kind, choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, choosing to hope when you have every reason not to. Grace didn't set out to change anyone's world. She simply acted from her heart. And in doing so, she walked through walls that had taken years to build, without even realizing they were there. And Lorenzo Cavallero, the man who had kept every person at arm's length for 11 long years, learned that the most terrifying thing a guarded man could do was simply be known. And that the right person makes that terrifying thing feel like coming home. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If this touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who loves a story about love that's earned, not given. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and which moment in this story stayed with you. I read every single one. We'll see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves, besties.